Okay, Brian, could you please introduce yourself for us and tell us a little bit about
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And welcome everybody to our very first webinar of 2023. And looks like from the chat, we've got some of you folks who were in the earlier iteration of this on this topic. We had a webinar we did back in November or December on building a CMDB in a cloud first organization. It seemed like something that a lot of folks are really struggling with. So welcome back, those of you who were here before, and welcome those of you who are here for the first time. My name is Brian Flora. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Beyond 20. I've been at Beyond 20 since 2006, so for a very long time now. Worn a lot of different hats, and everything from the consulting side to teaching ITIL 4 classes and ITIL 3 and ITIL 2 classes and so forth. And Rook, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Jones, commonly known as Rook. I've been in the ServiceNow ecosystem for about a dozen years now. I've been consulting most of that time, mostly in the ITOM space, dealing with questions about CMDB, operations management, and so forth. And looking forward to today's webinar. Yeah,
Rook, it looks like you brought a decent amount of your fan base to this webinar.
Yeah,
the Rookamaniacs, as I will the term I will coin here.
Let's
today.
not get that term.
Absolutely not.
I feel like that might stick.
It might now.
All right, well, let's move on now. Let's set expectations unacceptably high. Okay, so those of you who've worked with Beyond 20, know who we are and what we do, but our mission here is changing work life, right? We are trying to implement through education, consulting, advisory services, and technology and automation changes to organizations that change the way work gets done, the way people experience their jobs, and through that we've come to obviously the ITIL ecosystem in terms of training and consulting. We also have partnerships with ServiceNow, with Cherwell and Avanti, and several others. Those of you in the federal space, we are an 8A woman-owned small business, so that does make it a little bit easier to do business with us potentially. But if you're interested in any of these things, then please feel free to reach out to us after the webinar. We'd be happy to talk to you. But in the meantime, let's talk about the agenda. Today, we're going to talk about, a little bit of background about, of course, what a CMDB is. We talked about that in the last webinar, so we won't talk about that too much, but really how that supports, today we'll talk more about how it supports some of these other processes within your service management ecosystem, and some of the specific challenges that you deal with in managing a very
complex environment.
CMDB when most of your assets are cloud-based or hybrid or with multiple providers and so on, and how we go about. We're going to get down into a little more detail as to how we go about building that, and more importantly keeping that current, right? That was kind of the topic the last time, was how do we build it, and today it's really about, okay, yeah, we've built it, but how are we going to maintain this and keep it up to speed? So in terms of best practices for the CMDB, one of the most important things is that obviously we've got to have some sort of automation. That's been true for many years, that there's really no conceivable way to manually keep these things up to speed. And it's not one of these things where if a CMDB is 95% accurate, then it's 95% useful to you. It becomes a thing where if you can't trust the data to be darn near 100% accurate, then you won't trust it. You won't trust the decisions that you would make against it, and therefore your CMDB becomes kind of pointless to have.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah, exactly. So, we talk about this sometimes in the context of ITOM, IT operations management, and how we provide visibility into these cloud services, whether we're talking about, things that are in AWS or Azure or Google or Kubernetes or, what have you. But, how do we provide visibility into these things on an ongoing basis, especially as these things, if we talk about, infrastructure as code or infrastructure as a service, where we might be having, pretty regular updates and changes that are happening automatically in real time, all the time. So how do we make sure that that the CMDB is actually representative, a representative model of what the real environment looks like? So let's back up a little bit. So why do we need a CMDB in the first place? In terms of service management, it's one of these things that, those of you who know me know that I've always talked about the fact that the CMDB is simultaneously kind of the backbone for your service management implementation. It supports all of these other things. And, in a perfect world, you would think that maybe because this is going to support all these other things, that it might be the very first thing that you would implement. In terms of doing a service management or ServiceNow deployment or a process improvement effort or whatever, that, we might do CMDB first and then, do some of these other things later. Logically, that makes sense. But the other problem is, of course, that the CMDB doesn't have a lot of, really sexy metrics that go along with it, right? So it's a lot of really hard work, but a lot of what you're showing in terms of metrics when you're going back to the business, when you're, going back to the CIO or the CTO or the CEO or even your customers and showing them, hey, we did this huge effort. Your metrics are really a bunch of stuff that would have happened if you hadn't done this, right? Oh, well, you can just imagine how bad it would be if we didn't know, if we didn't have the CMDB in place. So from a practical standpoint, people end up putting these other processes in place. You tackle the service desk, you tackle incident management, you tackle request fulfillment, change management, service level management, some of these things, first, because they allow you to get momentum for the implementation. They, provide the metrics that, people can see and touch and so on. But then, your CMDB, when you go back to implement those, what it really ends up doing is leveling up your maturity level of basically every other process.
Yeah, it definitely becomes the storehouse of information, knowledge of how the business is run. Increasingly, CMDBs are becoming not just glorified spreadsheets of what we use technology-wise to provide our services. It's starting to implement the people and process as well as the technology altogether, and how you provide that value to your customers. And so it's more critical today than it was 10 years ago.
Right, which is saying something, because it was absolutely critical 10 years ago, right? But, the challenge with that there, though, is that, 10 years ago, we were having the same conversations about how important the CMDB was, but it was really hard to do.
Yep.
Right. I mean, you'd get a lot of nodding, and most folks that, worked in any kind of an operational capacity understood that, yeah, we really need to do this, but, the technology in a lot of ways hadn't really caught up. And it was just really, really hard to do in a way that was meaningful and in a way that, frankly, matched what the books and the theory said it was supposed to be, right?
Yeah, we also saw a lot of customers, or still see a lot of customers, who are maintaining their CMDB somehow outside of the platform that they use to deliver these services. And it's not really tying into the delivery of that, the operations of that process. It's not delivering value. So there's a lot of organizations where their operations teams, they have separate tools that are tracking, say they have SolarWinds that is tracking all of their network gear. They have something like SCCM that's tracking all their Windows servers. They're not combining all this information together. And more importantly, they're not really representing the relationships between these different separate assets in their organization and how those combine into delivering that service. It becomes a lot more clear once you can draw those relationships. If this goes down, what all is affected? What all does this power? What all depends on this? And that becomes a lot more critical in today's world.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's, one of these things that, while it's gotten considerably, it was already hard 10 years ago, it's harder now, right?
And it's moving so much faster.
Yep, exactly. So now, now we have these things that with containerization and Kubernetes and, cloud-based, that you may have something that, blinks in and out of existence in a matter of seconds. And, and is simultaneously more important than ever to track, right?
Yeah,
So,
especially for auditing purposes. If something were to happen during that couple seconds, for your teams, your SRE teams or your DevOps teams to try to figure that out and triage that, go back through the logs and figure out what came up. Having that represented in the CMDB may be critical for some organizations that have to have that auditable trail.
Sure. And if you're trying to do, IT service continuity management, you need to know exactly what you're going to reproducing at site B. It's important to know what everything is that's inside A and how it all relates together. Or if you're doing, problem management, as you're kind of discussing there, the ability to go in and really see at the time when that failed, what did the environment look like? What was going on, right?
And how did everything else react?
Right, exactly. And then, that provides the basis for a lot of the automation that we're really looking to do as we move into a CI/CD or, DevOps infrastructure as code type environments. It's got to be supported by what we continue to call here in your slides a real CMDB, the one that was an actual bona fide configuration database. So, one of the challenges here is that when we started talking about this 10 years ago, the holy grail that everybody was looking at was discovery, right?
Yeah.
How do we discover all those things that we have? And, you kind of mentioned the way a lot of people ended up solving that, or some of those things. They solved it through using some of their information security platforms, or SolarWinds, or SCCM, or, more likely some combination of 7 or 8 of those things, right?
Yeah, they started leveraging tools that may not necessarily were designed to deliver a CMDB-like experience. They weren't tracking the same information that we've come to be used to in a CMDB world.
Or, they went out and they purchased, some expensive licensing on whatever service management platform that they were on. And, if we were talking about this in the 2010 to say 2016, 2017 range, they were likely pretty disappointed by the outcomes, right? That in most cases, the reality didn't really deliver on what was sort of expected there, right? You think that's a fair statement?
Absolutely. Talked to a lot of customers that they kind of lost hope in CMDB simply because those products did not live up to the promises that were made. And they come into, they started seeking their own solutions. I've met a lot of customers who have either built their own solutions, or they go back to tracking things in spreadsheets. That it doesn't spread that knowledge throughout the environment, throughout the entire organization. Not anybody can go in and look up what is this server powering, or what does it depend on. But it also, it really doesn't reflect the real time. It required somebody to go in and manually update those things, which very quickly became also very untrustworthy.
Sure. So can you talk a little bit, Rook, about what we're talking about when we move from discovery toward real-time updates? What does that mean to you?
So a lot of discovery tools, whether it be SCCM or any kind of an agent-based thing, it's really kind of being triggered on a schedule, whether it's firing every hour, whether you're running that discovery every night. That Sure. It gives you a snapshot in time of what was happening when that tool did its thing. And that was when it updated the CMDB. If you're running discovery, for instance, at 2 a.m, and then at 9 a.m, you have some sort of an outage, someone referencing the CMDB may not be getting say a real-time idea of what is actually running in the environment at that moment. So real-time updates kind of changes the game. So if we can tie in these real-time updates that a lot of cloud providers already provide, Azure sends updates, AWS sends updates, we can subscribe to those updates with our platform and then update our CMDB in real time as those things happen. So the dependency on a snapshot in time sort of approach becomes a lot lower. This can really make sure that things are up to date when your cloud scales. So as load increases on my website and I scale up from 10 VMs to 20 VMs in my web server layer, then my CMDB is going to reflect that. And that is going to be critical for those use cases that we saw before. If I have business people who are wanting to know, for whatever reason, how much we're running right now, or if I have a C-suite officer who's wanting to know what my spend is at the minute, for conversations that they're having completely outside of operations, that information will be at their fingertips. So this is where we're seeing a lot of people starting to demand real-time updates in today's very short attention span sort of world and immediate gratification.
So it's really, something similar to like a Google search crawl, right?
Yes.
To a search engine crawl, going out and scanning, the website. But if it didn't scan your website since 2 weeks ago, any changes you made are not necessarily going to be reflected in terms of SEO, right?
That's right.
Same basic principle.
Yep.
Cool.
So go ahead.
So then we end up talking, you and I were talking earlier this week about this concept of service aware operations, right? So tell me a little bit about that.
We've got a lot of organizations out there who picture a CMDB just as a spreadsheet. This is my list of servers. This is my list of switches. And these are my routers. These are my printers. This is really all they kind of perceive a CMDB to be. And this is the value that they see getting out of a CMDB. And in today's world, your business folks don't care about these individual configuration items, the servers, the routers, the switches that you use to provide these services. What they care about is the service itself. That's what they're selling. That's what they're monitoring. When their customers call into the service desk, the customer is saying, this service is down, this service is impacted. So what we're really looking for nowadays is a service focus from both the operation side and the business side. So when somebody calls in our graphic here, you might see some red boxes. This sort of a dashboard presents an immediate real-time view of what's happening in my environment, in my business. And this can be displayed from the C-suite all the way down through the business teams. Operations teams can rely on this. And what we're seeing now is customers are driving to a very real-time sort of update of this dashboard. And that is changing the way service desks are working. It's changing the way operations teams are working. We've already got the development push of DevOps pushing these changes into our environment. And now the operations side of that is starting to monitor and report in such a way that it is also becoming more and more real time. So services have become the central point of conversation between business and your operations teams, your IT teams. And that is really where we're elevating the CMDB to. ServiceNow has just come out with, well, not just come out, in the last few years has come out with the Common Services Data Model, and that's speaking exactly to this. And what this is doing is it's bringing people and process into your CMDB, and you're starting to see a much more full picture of what's happening.
So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, for years we've been talking about service management and that concept of service management being, this paradigm shift from IT organizations being, gatekeepers or brokers of technology to being true, service brokers, right? Where we go from the primary task being to manage all of this technology to our role really is a broker-dealer model where we might be curating a portfolio of dozens or even, hundreds of services that may come from, some of which we provide in-house, some of which we provide certain elements of in-house, but are dependent on third parties for other parts, and some of which are completely outsourced. But yet, from a customer perspective, we're maintaining that accountability for the delivery of those services, in the service provider organization, right? We're ultimately the one throat to choke.
Exactly. And we've already seen other parts of IT start to involve the business at their grassroots level. DevOps is very much that way, Agile. All of these types of methodologies are now starting to involve the business stakeholder at the very beginning of the process. And it's involving them throughout the life cycle of my service. And ITIL is definitely sort of, I don't want to say pivoting, but it's certainly starting to emphasize this. And if you can imagine your business team seeing a dashboard like this, they can instantly see if their service is impaired. And that really can kind of trigger a faster response from the customer perspective, where if there's automatic notifications being sent to the consumers of these services, these could be automatically sent by the platform based on alarms that are being received from the cloud or from my environment, without a human needing to open an incident and get that process started in a more manual fashion. So this is the speed of today's business is starting to demand this sort of visibility, this sort of overarching awareness of what all is impacted. And CMDBs are starting to react. CMDB administrators are starting to look for this type of information feed.
Right. So in this particular model, then a service is actually a configuration item, right?
Exactly.
A service is a CI that is in your CMDB.
Yep.
So that we can build all of these other relationships between this service and other services, the infrastructure that supports it, the people that are on call for it, and all of those other things. Correct.
Correct. IT people tend to think of things as our concrete sort of hardware CIs, or application or software CIs. They don't tend,
right.
Yeah, exactly. They don't tend to think in services, and that's really the shift that everybody is moving towards. Your business consumers, they subscribe to services. That's what they're paying you for. And if that service, which is comprised of many complex moving parts, if any one of those parts jams up, it's like a car, it's going to stop in the middle of the road, and you have a whole car problem, not just a transmission problem. So a lot of organizations are starting to retrain their organizations to communicate internally at the service level. And this is where you're starting to see a lot of this shift to kind of, and it's all based in relationships. So all of that shifting is happening at the relationship level. A lot of these tools that are out in the ecosystem do not track it, like SCCM, for instance, does not track relationships. It does not.
So yeah, no, I'm sorry. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay. But yeah, I do want to take a moment to just tease one thing that, one thing we've been talking about internally among our team for some time over the last 6 months or so is that, as organizations move toward a DevOps or a CI/CD or, a real cloud-based, some of these more modern ways of thinking about producing and delivering services, what are they looking for? What is the corollary from the support organization, right? That, we've got this kind of, very modern, current version of delivery, but we're still a lot of times using a service desk model from 20 years ago, right? And there's a certain amount of incompatibility into what, what the support experience the business is looking for, and what customers are now looking for, and what that model looks for. So you'll see some webinars and white papers on that topic coming out in the next a few weeks, I believe. So a little teaser there.
Yes.
After the commercial, right? No, so what has, Rook, you were kind of getting to, some of the pitfalls that keep us from being able to execute on these things. So, what I think, all of us, there's probably a lot of people sitting in their offices or guest rooms, nodding along going, yeah, I get it. But
what's the point? Right.
Well, why is everybody not doing this now? What's in the way?
Well, what has been in the way up to this point, especially in the cloud, is the fact that the cloud way is entirely different from the data center way that we used to run our infrastructure. We are now working in a sort of a shared responsibility environment where we do not control the underlying infrastructure that is powering the virtual services that we are consuming to provide our services to our clients. And some notable points that came up with clients that I worked with in the past, where they ran large cloud environments, had multiple, they themselves were a service provider. So they were running virtual private clouds for multiple of their customers. Each environment had its own set of credentials. They had their own security requirements, agreements, contracts, and so forth. That organization had trouble setting up cloud discovery in such a way that they could reach into these thousands of virtual machines that were all governed by different clients, because of the requirement with cloud discovery and ServiceNow, it required local administrative credentials. So if they were running a virtual machine that ran Windows, they needed a local administrator account to be able to log into that in a traditional, very data center centric sort of approach, to be able to gather the information, such as what's the software running on this machine, what licenses is it consuming, what are the running processes from a security standpoint, for instance. It required mid servers to be set up. Those mid servers had to have access into those VPCs, into private subnets, to be able to do these queries on these VMs. And then when you're talking about hundreds of clients, aggregating that data together became a nightmare. And so it became a very sort of a prohibitive wall that blocked a lot of customers that needed to do this sort of discovery from being able to do so. There are other solutions out there, a lot of other ways to approach this, but now with the advent of the AWS Service Graph Connector, which we'll talk about in a moment, a lot of this the prohibited sort of wall or obstacle has been lifted for these clients.
No, and I mean, these were things that, when you talk about needing local administrative credentials or the mid servers, even when we were in the data center, I can recall a number of clients where, the operations folks would really want to get this information, but the security folks were going to say,
yeah,
no, absolutely not.
Excuse me? Exactly.
Right. You're just sort of creating this thing that if you crack this, you've got the keys to literally the entire kingdom and direct administrator access to everything in the environment.
Right.
It wasn't manageable. And then once you had various different VLANs and so forth, a lot of times you just couldn't even access that information in the first place, right? So you ended up with this a fairly heavy infrastructure hit in order to be able to go out and pull this information in, which is why we're talking about AWS here as an example, but as the largest public cloud connector, but the Service Graph Connector that ServiceNow has is pretty exciting from that perspective for
it changes the game.
This reason, but yeah, exactly. So
it definitely changes the game. So first off, for all the administrators out there, we remove with this Service Graph Connector the need for a mid server in your cloud, and that becomes instantly a sigh of relief from our security folks, from our IT administrators in the cloud. They don't have to try to architect these VPCs or multiple accounts within an organization, the access that the mid server needed across multiple protocols and ports to be able to access these machines. So that whole requirement is now gone. Secondly, we have minimal requirements for credentials that we used to have, because now we only need read access to the APIs that our cloud provider is giving us now. So this has changed the way, at least the way that cloud discovery is happening within the ServiceNow platform. And it is opening up the possibilities to these customers who have very expansive, very complex environments now in the cloud, in their provider. Now, we're going to speak here specifically to AWS's Service Graph Connector for ServiceNow, but Azure also has one. So if you're an Azure customer, the same thing applies. Obviously, they're using different services, but the same idea, the same architecture is in use there.
Is there one for Oracle Cloud yet?
I would have to check on that. That's an interesting question.
I don't remember off the top of my head. So that we'll have to take that as an action item.
I think they have one for IBM. So I think they're just hitting them in order of popularity.
Sure. Install base. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, tell us a little bit about the architecture and how it works.
Okay, so the way the approach was before, we had to have those accounts, we had to have access into those accounts, and that became very prohibitive. ServiceNow is very AWS organization aware, and if you're not familiar with AWS organizations, it is a structure where it allows you to have a management account, sort of a super account, where you have billing access, you have overall administrative and security access to all of the member accounts that you manage within your organization. Here on our slide, you can see under the bottom tier there, we have multiple accounts. You could think of these not only as different maybe areas of your business where they have their own VPCs. These could also be separate customers of your own if you're sort of an MSP sort of setup. We've also seen organizations where they maintain accounts for a dev environment, they have an account for test environment, an account for production. And what that allows you to do is to keep all of your credentials separate. All of security is very clearly delineated. ServiceNow now uses that organizational structure, and it uses the built-in cloud tools that AWS provides. In this case, we use the token service assume role functionality, and giving a non-privileged account the ability to assume a role in each one of those accounts to gather this information. It really kind of opens things up from a security perspective. There's not as much, because I can wrap controls around that. I can put control limitations on what these accounts can do. And since it's using a non-management account, it really drops the amount of risk.
Okay. And it looks like there are some questions here. Right?
Yeah.
We're gonna tackle one.
I think we answered James's question about Azure. Yes, we absolutely have an Azure Service Graph connector. Oracle Cloud also, if available. I will check on that, and hopefully by the end of the webinar, I can drop an answer into the chat for everybody. GPC as well. So Banish asks, so we are forced to implement account-based scanned since security is concerned about IP-based scanned, okay? Does AWS ServiceNow offer some solution integration that we can help so we can convert to IP-based scanned and security team feels comfortable and approves the solution? All right, so Banish, this sounds like it's a bigger conversation that we might be able to have as to what your goals are and what your restrictions are from a security standpoint, but you still can do a mid-server based traditional type of discovery, a cloud discovery from a mid-server within your cloud. You can absolutely still do that if it's more comfortable for the way your organization is architected. James asks, what ServiceNow licenses are needed for this? This is all ITOM subscription unit licensing for discovery. ITSM and what other ServiceNow licenses? Again, it's ITOM subscription units that you would get from ITOM Visibility or ITOM Discovery or whatever package you might already have.
Yep. Okay, so let's look at the config aggregator and tell us a little bit about that then.
Okay, so in the past, pulling all this information across multiple accounts and multiple regions, it took individual configurations for all of that. Now with the AWS config aggregator, and this is a service that AWS provides within AWS config, it can pull all of this information from those multiple accounts within your organization, all of the regions that you're utilizing across your organization and your environment. And all of that information is now aggregated together and pulled from one source with one API, well, multiple API calls, but essentially you're accessing one API endpoint. So this really greatly simplifies the administration, the configuration of setting all of this up, and it improves the process, the performance of pulling all that data, because since it is aggregated,
that
too, we're pulling a much smaller payload. And the way that ServiceNow, the way that ServiceNow has architected this is this data is then it's put into a secure S3 bucket, and then we're pulling that information from the bucket in such a way that it's a lot more performant and secure.
Cool. And that ties in with the systems manager.
Yes.
Well,
So
right?
now this is the big news, in my opinion. This is the exciting part. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, we used to have a mid-server that logged into these VMs using a credential, just like you would RDP into a machine or execute a WMI query against a machine. We would need to have local admin access to that device in order to run these queries and pull all that information back. Now, with the Service Graph connector, we're actually accessing the AWS Systems Manager service within your account, and that service now has cloud native access to your VMs. It manages those, and it's pulling back this information without having to make those OS connections in. And this is why we were able to get rid of the mid server. We don't need to have that requirement. We don't need the credentials anymore. And to a lot of organizations, this opens the floodgates to be able to start doing a more comprehensive cloud discovery. So this is the big news, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, this is what makes, those actual real-time updates possible for, the first time in my career, right?
Yes.
That these things are actually possible. There's another question. How about OS COTS software versions?
Yes. So James, that information is exactly what we're pulling from Systems Manager. I can query not only what operating system data that I need, such as version, patch number, what have you. I can also pull some of that, the same hardware information, serial number, RAM, hard disk, all of that sort of configuration data from my VM, as well as installed software. So I can now query, am I running something like MS SQL on this machine, and what kind of licensing is that under, and so forth. So yes, we can pull all that information through the Systems Manager. That's the exciting part. We no longer have to log into the OS and run a WMI query. We can get it all from Systems Manager. Yes, great, cool. Exactly. This is where everybody starts to get excited, I think.
Yeah, it's solving some real problems, like I said, that have existed for pretty much my entire career, that are suddenly the clouds are parting and kind of go, wow, really? Yeah, so just kind of the key takeaways here, we're actually talking about finally being able to build a CMDB with services, which, again, being in the classroom and having, taught ITIL 2, ITIL 3, ITIL 4, it's something that we've been really talking about in the industry for a really long time, but was hard to actually execute on and really actually, to really bring it home. But now we can use these service graph connectors to speak in real time and to, really adhere to security and cloud best practices while getting the information we need in real time, taking away the need for a mid server and automatically being able to account for these different regional accounts. If you've got different accounts for different customers or different clients, or one for EMEA versus APAC or what have you, we're able to handle those things. And so with that, let's go into any of the questions that are remaining. It looks like, how is dependence mapping done? Somebody was asking about. Rook, I know you answered this in the channel, but you want to talk about that just for a minute?
Let's spend a minute on that. So we talked about earlier in the webinar as to why we are doing all of this, and the whole purpose is to bring this into our CMDB and build a service out of all of these moving parts. This is done in the cloud through tagging, and ServiceNow is very, very much advanced. If you've not looked into how ITOM works with this, or CSDM works with this, when you're building your application services, which represent your stacks that are powering these services, you can do this based on tags. So if you have a tagging strategy that is doing things like it's naming the name of the service within your organization that it is part of and that it's powering. I've seen organizations name the tier. I've seen dependencies called out with tags to where this requires A requires B. All of that can be consumed by ServiceNow and automatically put together in a dynamic way to where my CMDB is maintained. So I can build an application service record that depends on, it looks for these tags. And as these automatic updates are coming into my CMDB from my cloud provider, if I'm powering off some VMs and powering on new VMs, maybe I'm doing a blue-green deployment of a new version, that is going to automatically update ServiceNow. My service stays up to date. Now, if I'm running some sort of a service-based dashboard where it's showing blue, yellow, red on status, this is going to keep everything up to date. So if one of these new VMs goes down, within seconds, my dashboard is going to show it if we're tied into event management. So a lot of this starts to bubble up. This is the ground layer, the very critical piece of tying my cloud into my CMDB so that we can realize all of these returns on investment, if you want to call them that, or
self-healing infrastructure.
Exactly. And it's not just for your IT teams anymore. So CMDB is meant to be consumed. Your security team can be watching this. The business owner of that service can be watching this and get real-time updates. I've talked to customers where the CIO had this dashboard up on the wall on a big LCD screen, a big 60-inch TV in their office. And so they got immediate, when something turns red, it would catch their attention. They'd look up to the wall and they didn't have to be notified by anybody. They could sit there and watch it. And if it didn't turn green in a moment, then they picked up the phone or they were texting somebody that knew what was happening. So this is very much the ground layer of a lot of things that can be done within the organization in a dynamic way. It changes the way people work, especially your ops teams, and I would think definitely your business teams as well. Yep, you can absolutely, James, you can absolutely have the platform. And once that service turns red, it's automatically opening up an ITSM ticket. So we have an incident open. Maybe we're automatically triggering some orchestration to where the ITOM platform is going out and it's executing a script that is prepared by your cloud administrators to do a certain thing within the cloud. Say it's running a command, or it's changing the configuration parameters of my auto scaling group, whatever that might be. Whatever needs to happen, your cloud team usually can provide a script and a mechanism to where the platform, if the conditions are right and it meets the criteria of what needs to happen, your cloud team can provide the script to the platform. The platform can go out and do it within seconds, instead of taking minutes and minutes and minutes of somebody getting back to their desk from lunch and realizing what's going on, reading through the log and making sure that this is what they need to do. All of it can now be automated. So it all starts with the CMDB. You can't automate unless you have a very solid, trustworthy CMDB.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is some of the information that, that really ties into what we're going to build on that, responsive automation topics that are going to be coming up in the next few weeks. The support experience, I think, we've been talking about the fact that the support experience really needs to change. We're still using, like I said, a year 2000, support model that doesn't really match with what the business and everything else within the service management organization has been doing. So we'll be talking about more of that very soon here.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm excited to get into that, because this is, like you said, this is changing the way things are being done in a lot of organizations. This is automation has become, it's been on the horizon for a while. We're all talking about AI and machine learning, and this is where it's going to start happening, is when we can reliably make decisions and automate those decisions in many areas. Not all areas are going to be ripe for automation, but I think a lot of them are going to be powered in almost real time.
Yeah.
Does ServiceNow have a lightweight version for small to medium businesses? You want to take that one, Brian?
Yeah, not as much a lightweight version, but that's there are ways to approach it so that you can. So yes and no. I don't know. It's hard to give a 2-sentence answer on that. I realize
it is. But it's kind of a complex topic.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be offering it basically as a managed service, so that for SMBs, you basically get a slice of our ServiceNow instance that an SMB could get what they need from, without having to have this enterprise level solution all to themselves. So that's kind of how we would address that.
It sounds like Diana needs to contact us.
Very possibly. So, okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate all the time and questions. If you have other questions, feel free to reach out. I got some resources available here on the slide. If you haven't, go to, beyond20.com/resources. You'll find, white papers and helpful templates and things like that. Lots of information on the blog, hundreds of articles on CMDB and cloud and so forth. And also, check out our ServiceNow tutorials on our YouTube channel at Beyond 20 LLC. We've got a lot of Sharewell and ServiceNow tutorials, anywhere from 2 to 15-minute videos on how to do all kinds of things. There are several hundred videos out there, and they're all available at no cost. So please make yourself
avail yourself
of those things. Yeah, exactly. Otherwise, feel free to reach out with any questions, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
you.